Hello, everyone. Welcome again to this our course in Introduction to Moral Theology. Last week, we looked at the relationship between Scripture and moral theology. Today, we will continue exploring Bretsky's model by looking carefully at the normatively human sector on the rational claim axis and exploring the traditional ethical theory known as the natural law. Before we do this, however, let us keep in mind that there are four main positions regarding the relation between scriptures and ethics, which will have a positive or negative impact on the acceptability or lack thereof of using the natural law as a proper approach to Christian ethics. The first position can be called the no relation position because it believes that Christian ethics are a revealed morality and not a secular construct that provides standards to discover how to live in an authentically upright manner. The middle of the road position affirms that most of Christian ethics correspond to authentic human morality, but the former contains certain themes, values, and precepts that are discernible only to the believer. The Glaubensethik, also known as faith ethics, position maintains that the Bible is an important source of moral teaching that is absolutely necessary to aid human reason. In the words of Cardinal Ratzinger, quote, part of the task of the magisterium is to preserve the apostolic teaching contained in the deposit of the faith found in biblical revelation. This process is aided by God's continuing grace that in turn aids human reason, end of quote. And I would add that in this particular role, the whole church has a role to play. Position number 4 is the moral autonomy position that states that Scripture holds nothing distinctive to Christian ethics, and thus, in terms of the content of morality, Christians have neither special commands nor special revelation. In other words, demands for the moral life are one and the same for Christians and non-Christians alike. Let us remember that according to Bretsky's multi-strand double helix model, there are 4 sources for doing moral theology. Expressly, the Bible, tradition of the community, human experience, and the normatively human. In other words, following Bretsky's model, we can confidently assert that there exists a relationship between scriptures and Christian ethics, and that we do not have to choose so much as to integrate scriptures with the other 3 sources of moral theology in order to ensure that our methodological approach is optimal. With all this in mind, let us now look more closely at the normatively human sector on the rational claim axis of Bretsky's model, as represented by the natural law theories. Most natural law theories are grounded in 2 fundamental premises or claims. Expressly, the ontological, that is reality-based, and the epistemological, that is knowledge-based. Each fundamental premise, in turn, makes 2 further claims related to normativity and universality, resulting in a 6 basic claims system of morality. The first foundational claim is ontological, and asserts that in some real sense, there is an objective moral order, which is not the result of social construct or any given age or culture, but that is grounded in our human nature. In other words, there is a common human nature and a moral universe that demands that we conform ourselves to it, and not vice versa. The second foundational claim is epistemological and posits that there is, in some sense, an objective moral order, a rightness and wrongness that is neither individually nor collectively or culturally determined, and that human beings can, in some real sense, know the nature of this moral order. The third foundational claim refers to the normability of the moral life. That is, that the moral life can be fashioned into ethical norms, that is, moral prescriptions and proscriptions, or ethical do's and don'ts, that ought to help form our moral character, and guide our ethical discernment from perception to reflection to action. The fourth foundational claim defends that the normability of the moral life exerts a claim on us. In other words, the norms become binding on us, irrespective of our own inclinations and desires. The fifth foundational claim asserts that moral norms can be constructed in a certain way so as to apply to all peoples at all times and in all places. In other words, that there are universal moral norms. The sixth foundational claim states that there exist moral absolutes, that is, norms that are binding on all of us. To be sure, there are universal moral norms that apply on Christian and non-Christian alike, regardless of historical context and individual or collective circumstances. All these foundational claims are debated at one degree or another by Christian and non-Christian ethicists alike. Consequently, it is good for us to add two important nuances to what has thus far been presented regarding the natural law theories, namely, the levels of moral norms and the fonts of morality. According to St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae, in the prima parts of the second part, the prima secundae as it is known, question 94, humans use two types of reason to discern the best moral response to a moral conundrum. Using the speculative reason, humans evaluate abstract truths and arrive at the, and I insist, the foundational moral precept, expressly bonum est faciendum et prosequendum et malum vitandum. This self-evident first principle and its related universal principles, however, are insufficient for giving us concrete guidance in a vast number of our ethical decisions. For that, we need to employ our practical reason, which is the second type of reason. Using recta ratio, that is, our practical or right reason, we can apply universal principles to our daily living. In other words, practical reason allows us to deal with changeable matters by applying general principles to concrete situations. This includes the possibility of encountering legitimate differences or deviations from the general principles, especially the more we get into the nitty-gritty of actual concrete particular situations. Derived from these general considerations, we can establish three general levels of moral norms. First, the level of universal precepts that are always binding and that are expressed as abstract truths. These are moral concepts that are universally true because of their relation to the foundational moral precept. Remember that long phrase I read in Latin right now? We can translate it simply as do good and avoid evil. Second, the level of middle axioms or general principles, which are generally true, that is, applicable in most cases, or as Aquinas would say, ut in pluribus, but open to exceptions. These middle axioms or good standards help us apply universal precepts which need to be interpreted and refined to fit adequately to the concrete situation at hand. Third, concrete material norms for different circumstances are arrived at through the use of practical reason and the virtue of epikeia, that is, the virtue of finding what is fitting, suitable, and reasonable. Concrete material norms require a certain amount of freedom and are more open to both change and fallibility. Keeping in mind the different levels of moral norms will help us to translate the abstract and universal principle into concrete and particular norms that will come to bear in a realistic way in the real, historically grounded lives of men and women, and in their struggles with many and varied moral conundrums. A thorough evaluation of moral acts, however, requires not only to be cognizant of the levels of moral norms, but also to look into the three fonts of morality, namely the finis operis, the finis operantis, and the fortuna. The finis operis is the goal, purpose, or end of the action itself. The finis operantis is the goal, purpose, or end of the agent. This is also known as our intentionality, our intention. And the fortuna are the circumstances or the real life context out of which the person is performing the act. To these three, we must add, contemporarily speaking, the finis opens, or the impact of the action on the world. This thoroughgoing understanding of the levels of moral norms and of the fonts of morality can help us understand the nuances involved in judging the goodness or wrongness of any given action. It will also allow us to enter into a highly and hotly debated issue regarding Catholic moral theology's defense of the so-called intrinsece malum, or intrinsically evil acts. Proposed by St. John Paul II in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor of 1993, number 80, intrinsece malum are, quote, whatever is hostile to life itself, end of quote. Later on that same number, JP2 offered a list of intrinsece mala that mirrored the one contained in Gaudium et Spes number 27. What is important for us to keep in mind here, because of a lack of time, is that we cannot have a genuinely intrinsically evil act unless, to a sufficient extent, the requisite moral intention and concrete circumstances have already been adequately factored into our moral analysis of the act. Otherwise, an unnuanced bandying about of the term intrinsically evil from an overly narrow physicalist paradigm may lead us to false moral analysis. In the concrete, the evaluation of any and every moral act must take into a sufficient account the intention and the circumstances involved. The natural law theory or theories is still espoused or are still espoused as one of the major ways to do moral theology in the Catholic Church. However, many people object to them and to the main brainchild, if you may want to call it that, and that is the intrinsece malum. In fact, the reason why I decided to include Grimes' Theology of Whose Body in this week's reading list was so that I could give you a chance to look at, I call it a test case for the natural law theory, especially for those natural law theories, plural, that represent the most radical kind of a way of understanding natural law, which is the physicalist formulation of the natural law. I look forward to reading your postings on this week's threaded discussion to see how you integrated the critique issued by Grimes with the presentation of the natural law theory according to Brzezinski's description. Hoping to guide your integration of Brzezinski's presentation with Grimes' critique, I would like to end this week's video by presenting 6 common points of contention regarding the natural law. First, after the fall, meaning after original sin erupted in the world, especially Protestant ethicists would say that we cannot or not entirely rely on human reason, for it has been marred by sin. Second, there is no common human nature that can provide a cross-cultural or trans-historical grounding for ethical judgments. Hence, while universal moral norms generally hold true in most cases, there still are legitimate exceptions in other situations. Third, we must be leery and weary of the so-called naturalistic fallacy, expressly of moving from an observation that something exists or is in a certain way in the physical universe to the conclusion that one therefore ought to conform one's moral behavior to that fact. Fourth, we need to make a clear distinction between A, The natural law being grounded in a certain basic human nature that calls us to live ethically in relation to some sort of an objective moral order, and B, particular articulations and understandings of the ramifications of these two foundational assertions. Fifth, any theory of the natural law and moral norms does not exist in timeless and static abstractions, but grows, develops, and of necessity changes according to different situations, insights, and issues which arise in the real, historical, grounded lives of men and women. Think about the examples of the church's changing in its position of slavery and usury. Sixth and final, in a morally complex world, we could build an abstract set of moral norms with no exceptions. However, this set would not be grounded in reality. Instead, we need to admit a certain degree of ambiguity and changeability, that is, contingency, in order to create a moral system that is indeed grounded in reality. Remember that these six are objections that ethicists, Christian and non-Christian, have aimed at the natural law theory or theories. I invite you to think about them and to try to integrate them in your analysis of Grimes' chapter book, and then, of course, to see how you integrate that with Brzezinski's moral system. I want to conclude by saying that thus far in our course, we have explored context, scriptures, and natural law as important components of a well-rounded method of doing moral theology. In a couple of weeks, we will explore virtue ethics and conscience and authority. This will lead us to a midpoint in our course in which you will be equipped with the essential tools to do moral theology, either as an academic or, more importantly, as a pastoral minister. Our midterm oral exam will be an opportunity to, on one side, test your knowledge, and on the other side, ask any burning question that you may have. I will give you more on that as time approaches to do the oral exam. For now, allow me to thank you for your attention and to encourage you to keep up the good work. I look forward to reading your postings on our threaded discussion. In the meantime, stay strong, safe, and God bless.